It is the responsibility of any new government to look carefully at the range of activities that the taxpayers fund and ask the tough questions. Is an expenditure serving the public interest? Does it represent good value for taxpayers? Can the objective be achieved more cost-effectively or a better outcome delivered at the same cost? In every portfolio, across every spending program, we've had to look closely at what we do and how we do it. In my own portfolio, that includes our national broadcasters, the ABC and the SBS, which receive about $1.4 billion every year from the government. After working closely with the broadcasters for the last 8 or 9 months, it's clear that there is a great opportunity for them to modernise their businesses without reducing the resources they have available for programming. In other words, without reducing the quantity or the quality of what Australians view and listen to on ABC and SBS. That's what productivity is all about, getting the same or ideally a bigger bang for a smaller buck. Running the ABC, or indeed SBS, is not easy. The ABC, for example, is required by its charter to provide a balance between programs of wide appeal and specialised programs. There's a conundrum. If the ABC simply goes for ratings and emulates the approach of the commercials, people will ask why we need it at all. If its programming is too arcane, Sophocles in the original Greek perhaps, people will ask why we are wasting taxpayers' dollars on elitist entertainment. The commercial broadcaster's revenues are a function of its ratings. Very simple. The ABC's are a function of its ability to persuade the government of the day to give it money. The commercial broadcaster's core KPI, like any private sector firm, is its profitability. The ABC's KPIs, set out in its charter, are much more subjective than a line in an income statement. All of this makes it much harder to run a public broadcaster. There simply isn't the same relentless daily pressure to innovate, to cut costs, to lift productivity that there is in the private sector. Now, despite that, I must acknowledge that there has been real innovation at both of the public broadcasters, especially in digital media, which, as you know, is within the statutory charter of both the ABC and SBS. Equally, I should acknowledge that the SBS has always been a leader in doing more with less, in no small part because it's never had much money to play around with. When we restructured the bankrupt 10 network more than 20 years ago, we learned a good deal from SBS's lean operating model, and it is still in many respects a good example today. Finding efficiencies and delivering new services are not mutually exclusive pursuits. With the right reforms and leadership, the ABC and SBS will emerge from this process much stronger organisations, capable of generating even better value from the money Australians invest in their operation. Now, as you know, the Abbott government inherited a growing mountain of debt, and despite numerous promises to the contrary from Wayne Swan, a budget deeply in deficit and without big policy changes certain to remain in deficit. The melancholy consequence of spending more than you receive in income is more and more debt. And the fundamental, inescapable fact is this: if we let things go on as they were, we are on track to record deficits forever and pile up a mountain of debt, $600 billion or more. So we had to raise more revenue and/or cut spending. None of that is popular. Labor and the Greens dispute the need for the government to take any action. Bill Shorten has offered no alternative plan. Unless you've got an alternative plan to prepare the budget, what you're really saying is, don't worry, keep spending, keep borrowing, hope for the best, and let our kids and grandkids sort it out. Now, that's not the Liberal way. That's not a responsible way. It's not what Australians expect from our government. So we have made savings across the board, and that includes, as I'll detail, the ABC and the SBS. Is it seriously argued that the public broadcasters should be exempt from the spending cuts that apply to almost every other government department and service? Some have pointed to a statement made by Tony Abbott on the eve of the election that there would be, quote, no cuts to the ABC or SBS. These remarks need to be understood in context. Prior to the election, many people, including competing media groups, urged the coalition to take an axe to the ABC in order to curtail their on-air and online activities. Both Joe Hockey, the Shadow Treasurer at that time, and I, the Shadow Communications Minister, made it quite clear that we had no plans to make cuts of that nature at the public broadcasting. But if there were to be savings made across the board, and plainly there were, the ABC and SBS could not be exempt, could not expect to be exempt from the obligation to contribute by eliminating waste and inefficiencies. Now, unless you believe that Mr Abbott was in that one line on election eve intending to contradict and overrule the very careful statements of intention made by Mr Hockey and myself, his remarks can only be understood in the same context, which left open savings of a kind which would not diminish the effective resources ABC and SBS had available to produce content. Now, I asked towards the end of last year the Department of Communications to undertake an efficiency study to identify savings that could be made by improving efficiencies in the back-of-house departments of the ABC. In other words, savings that could be made without reducing the resources available for programming. That was a very deliberate move on my part. The easiest way to cut costs in a television network is simply to cancel programs and replace them with cheaper ones. More difficult is to go through the way the business operates, line by line, and ask, can we do this more efficiently, with fewer people, with fewer fixed assets or other expensive resources? Now, a commercial broadcaster is always going to look for savings that do not impact on programming quality, because that is the key to its ratings and hence to its revenues. And if it cuts programming and its ratings go down, its revenues go down, and it ends up potentially in a death spiral. A public broadcaster, which like the ABC does not carry advertising, is not so clearly constrained. In other words, while it was obvious that ABC and SBS were going to have to contribute to the overall budget repair strategy, I wanted to make sure those savings would be made in the most intelligent and business-like fashion. The Department of Communications was very ably assisted by Peter Lewis, for many years the Chief Financial Officer of the Seven Network, as well as senior executives from both ABC and SBS. The study was provided to the ABC and SBS in April to assist their boards and management in identifying the areas they may not have previously explored in their efforts to improve efficiency. It highlighted outdated business and administrative practices where they could pursue savings without affecting programming. Given the findings of the efficiency study, we announced a 1% reduction in funding to the ABC and SBS in the budget in May. This contributed savings over 4 years of $38.3 million for the ABC and $8.5 million for SBS. This was not an ongoing efficiency dividend, but as I stated at the time, a down payment on larger savings to be made following consultation with the broadcasters on how they could best implement the findings of the efficiency study and progress their own savings initiatives. I want to record again the government's thanks to Mr Lewis, the team from my department, and of course the management of ABC and SBS in preparing that efficiency study. In its 146 pages, the Lewis efficiency study discusses 48 operational activities across the ABC and SBS. It identifies 5 areas where significant efficiencies and savings can be achieved. Working together, obvious. Efficiencies from greater operational cooperation between the ABC and SBS while preserving their separate and unique programming identities. Harnessing new technologies, modernising the business, improved resource allocation, financial transparency and governance, improving the same. Now, ever since the prospect of these savings has been raised, the ABC, or people claiming to speak for it, have suggested that this or that program will be a casualty. At one point, even the beloved Peppa Pig was said to be facing the axe. Apparently, we were going to take on the 3-year-olds of Australia, and their mothers, I might add. And then, when that strained credulity Tony Jones and Lateline were substituted for the pig, only to be followed by the state line versions of 7:30 on Friday evenings. Now, let me be quite clear. The savings I'm announcing today are not of a scale that requires any particular change to programming. All of the savings can be found within operational efficiencies of the kind canvassed in the Lewis Efficiency Study. But remember, while money is one scarce resource a linear television broadcaster has to manage, another scarce resource is time in the schedule. Everyone can't have their favourite program on at 7:30 on ABC One. Broadcasters have to make choices, and they make changes to their programs all the time. The ABC, I know, is particularly concerned that the median age for its television audience is 61. That's to say half its audience is under 61 and half is older than it. I find this reassuring. It means I'm still one of the ABC's younger viewers. I'm there. It's one of the many things I have in common with my grandson, who's 14 months. The ABC will change programs because it thinks something else will rate better, or it might think the money spent on program A can be better spent on program B, or it might think that money spent on television can be better spent on online. That's the normal business of a media company. The alternative, which some might like, I grant you, is that nothing ever changes, but that is a recipe for eventual irrelevance. Now, there's a temptation for management to blame the government for some of these program changes, often changes they've had in mind for a long time. That would be cowardly. The ABC management know that they can meet these savings without the resources available to programming being reduced. Furthermore, they know that the government and their board know too. The ABC has the most extensive broadcasting network in rural and regional Australia. This is one of the ABC's greatest strengths. The efficiency study noted that in the absence of commercial providers, the ABC's local radio service, particularly in regional and rural Australia, is relied upon for local news and, of course, the essential emergency broadcaster function. The study notes that this requires a physical presence at the local level with its associated staff, operating and capital expenses. While the study did suggest that the ABC should review the size and location of radio stations so they match changing population sizes, it did not recommend any changes to the level of radio coverage in rural and regional areas. There is nothing more clearly within the letter and spirit of the ABC's charter than its local radio services in regional and rural Australia. With the enormous flexibility offered by the internet and digital technologies, coupled with the enthusiasm for storytelling of their local news teams, without further expense, we should be able to see, if the management choose, more local news with pictures on the air and on the net. Now, turning to the details of the savings. In total, including the 1% down payment announced in the May budget, the full savings the broadcasters will return to the budget amounts to $308 million over 5 years. For the ABC, this means it will receive $5.2 billion over 5 years rather than $5.5 billion, a saving of $254 million or 4.6%. The ABC expects that it will have implementation costs over this period of $41 million in order to achieve those savings. For the SBS, this means its operating budget will be reduced by $25.2 million over the 5-year period, or 1.7%. A legislative change to allow SBS to generate further revenue by changes to its advertising arrangements brings SBS's total savings returned to the budget to $53.7 million, or 3.7%. As you will deduce, we are, after extensive discussions with SBS, assuming that the additional revenue to the SBS from the advertising changes amounts to $28.5 million over 5 years. To put this in context, the funding proposal will reduce aggregate government funding to both national broadcasters over the 5 years from 2014-15 to 2019-20, from $6.9 billion to $6.6 billion, a total reduction in Commonwealth expenditure of 4.4%. Now, the government provides the ABC with the majority of their, and the SBS with the majority of their funding, but it has no power to direct the broadcasters in relation to operational matters. Decisions regarding which efficiencies will be implemented and when are matters for the ABC and the SBS boards. Now, turning to advertising on SBS. SBS currently has a strict limit of 5 minutes of ads per hour. In line with a recommendation from the efficiency study, the government intends to introduce legislation into the Parliament to allow for a more flexible approach, allowing the network to average the 5 minutes per hour across the day, but run no more than 10 minutes in any given hour. This means the existing daily limit of 120 minutes will be maintained, which is well below the 350 minutes per day commercial advertisers can devote to advertising. Consider that the two highest television revenue results for SBS since it started to carry advertising in 2003 were $72.3 million in 2009-10 and $73.4 million in 2013-14, and those were, in no small part, due to the FIFA World Cup. Compare this to the 2013-14 advertising revenue earned by commercial broadcasters of $3.9 billion. So we're talking about less than 2% of that commercial television advertising pie. SBS maintained that from this change, they will receive $8 to $9 million per annum of additional revenue. Their costing model is robust, although there are some who dispute it and say it's too conservative. The efficiency review thought the most optimistic level of earning would be $20 million a year. Whichever way you look at it, the additional revenue SBS could collect from this change is not material compared to the revenues of the commercial broadcasters. As I said, this change will require legislation, like other media reforms the government is considering, and we intend to put this amendment to the Parliament in the first quarter next year. Now, turning to financial transparency and governance. The focus of the efficiency study and the work I've undertaken with both broadcasters is about more than repairing the budget. It's always also about reform that will modernise both organisations, pave the way for productivity gains, and ensure our national broadcasters are focused on good business practices for the long term. In this vein, I've looked at the budgeting and decision-making structures of the broadcasters and at mechanisms to improve transparency of their operations. The ABC and SBS are independent corporations created under their respective acts and under the Public Government's Performance and Accountability Act. As the Minister, I'm accountable to Parliament for the performance of agencies within my portfolio, and performance relates to many aspects of their operations that are quite distinct from programming decisions. An interesting insight from the efficiency study was that the ABC and SBS boards would benefit from a clearer understanding of the government's budget priorities and the outcomes the government is seeking from its annual investment of taxpayers' money. This needs to be carefully balanced against the statutory independence of both organisations. Parliament included provisions in the broadcasters establishing legislation that provides the Minister with the right to offer formal advice on operational and financial matters to each of the boards, Section 8 of the ABC Act and Section 11 of the SBS Act. That advice must be considered by the boards, but can of course be ignored. But importantly, it would be a very transparent way of providing advice to the broadcasters on matters that do not affect their independence. Let me set out some of the matters I intend to raise with the ABC. For reasons I frankly do not understand, the ABC does not have an independent Chief Financial Officer. That role is undertaken by Mr. David Pendleton, the very capable Chief Operating Officer, who in that role is responsible for most of the resources and cost base of the ABC. A company like the ABC, in my view, and I think this is consistent with modern corporate practice, should have a qualified CFO who reports directly to the board as well as the Chief Executive and is fearlessly independent, ensuring that the management and board understand precisely where and how funds are being spent and what everything costs. Equally, I propose to recommend to the board that the position of Editor-in-Chief no longer be combined with that of the Managing Director. It creates the impression that the Managing Director is directly in charge of ABC News and Current Affairs, which he is not. and given the wide range of his responsibilities, could not be. The board should expect the head of news and current affairs, like the CFO, to report directly to the board as well as to the managing director, thus enabling the board to discharge its very important statutory obligation about news I'll come to in a moment. Another matter is providing more granular detail on where the ABC and SBS spend their money and how it relates to their charter obligations. In my view, the ABC and SBS should, so far as possible, seek to be as transparent as a public listed company. The best cure for suspicion and the best way to promote trust and confidence is sunlight. Other matters I propose to include in the recommendations are to encourage the broadcasters to cooperate closely as between themselves, to maximise the efficiency of public broadcasting in Australia, as identified in the SBS Act, and to set out each year the steps the board has taken to meet its statutory obligations, including that in Section 8 of the ABC Act, and I quote, to ensure that the gathering and presentation by the corporation of news and information is accurate and impartial according to the recognised standards of objective journalism. It's the end of the quote. That last point is a very important one, and I acknowledge Mr Spiegelman's recent reviews of the ABC news coverage of certain issues. But it is widely thought, including by many people who either write to me or write about me, that the Minister is responsible for ensuring that the ABC's news and current affairs is accurate and impartial. The government does not and should never have any control over the news and current affairs of the ABC or SBS. Mr Putin's model of media management is no more worthy of emulation than his foreign policy. But the ABC and SBS boards are responsible for their objectivity and accuracy. I have on occasions heard directors say they don't want to get involved. Well, if they don't want to get involved, they should resign. The board of each broadcaster has that responsibility. It must discharge it, and it must be seen by the public diligently to discharge it. Now, we all expect a lot from our national broadcasters. We have every right to. Projected expenditure of $6.6 billion over the next 5 years after the proposed savings I've outlined today represents a significant commitment by taxpayers to those two organisations by any reasonable measure. It's the Australian people who will judge whether or not they are getting value for money. It's the millions of citizens who tune into ABC or SBS each week who will decide whether the government should continue to invest billions of dollars in these two great national institutions on their behalf. To their credit, the ABC and SBS are well loved and well trusted, certainly more so than any political party, minister or indeed angry columnist. And as I've noted before, the role of the public broadcasters in our national life is more important than ever as the business model of newspapers in particular is under threat and newsrooms dwindle. With this growing importance comes even greater pressure for both ABC and SBS to uphold even higher standards of balance and integrity in their coverage. And as I've discussed today, to demonstrate greater professionalism, transparency and efficiency in their handling of scarce public resources. If the management of the ABC think they cannot find a 5% saving through efficiencies, well, they're selling themselves short and letting down the people of whose resources and trust they are the custodians. Thank you all very much.